After the fête de Trianon, the court returned to Compiègne, where it remained for 3 weeks. This palace, where the emperor had received Marie-Louise on her arrival in France, was at that time the object of his special preference. He had ordered works to be carried out on the estate, which were under the direction of Berthaud, the architect, and were being executed with a rapidity which was nothing less than marvelous. New gardens had been created by this architect, and an entirely new appearance had been given to the residence. So great were the embellishments that had been effected that the park seemed totally transformed. It was now one of the most beautiful and most elegant of the emperor's pleasure houses. Their Majesty's arrival at Compiègne was saddened by the death of General Ordnay, governor of the palace, who was struck down on the following day by apoplexy and who died under the eyes of Dr. Lemernier. The general had come the day before to Compiègne to receive the emperor and empress, and Napoleon had complimented him on his good health. He regarded him as one of the bravest and the best of his officers. General Ordnay had a long time commanded with distinction to himself the mounted grenadiers of the guard. His rough, plain-spokenness sometimes amused the ladies at court, but he was one of those men who are endowed with an iron constitution, both moral and physical, rather uncultivated perhaps, but in any case of a loyalty without flaw, of rigid principles, trained in the laws of severe discipline, and incapable of compounding with his duties. In the meanwhile, the King of Rome was growing in strength and beauty under the vigilant care of Madame Montesquieu, who loved him as a son, and who had for him the most minute solicitude. He was carried every morning to his mother, who kept him with her during the hour of her toilette. In the daytime, in the intervals between her music and drawing lessons, Marie-Louise used to go to the young prince's apartment and work at his side at some piece of needlework. Often followed by the nurse who carried the child, she would take him to his father whilst he was at work. When he was announced, Napoleon would rise to go and receive him, nobody being allowed to enter his cabinet. The nurse was forced to remain outside, and Marie-Louise would be asked to bring her son in herself. The empress had so little trust in herself in taking the child from the arms of the nurse that Napoleon would hasten to go and meet her, and would take his son into his arms, carrying him away, covering him with kisses. This workroom, which was the scene of the birth of so many skillful maneuvers intended to repel the attacks of our eternal enemies, and so many vast and generous schemes of government, was very often also the silent witness of Napoleon's paternal tenderness. How often have I watched the emperor there, keeping his son at his side, as though he were impatient to initiate him in the art of government, either seated on his favorite settee near the mantelpiece, which was decorated with 2 magnificent bronze busts of Scipio and of Hannibal, occupied in reading some important report, or going to his writing table, which was cut out in the center, and the sides of which spread out like wings, covered with his numerous papers to sign a dispatch, each word of which had to be weighed. His son, seated on his knees or pressed against his bosom, never left him. Endowed with a marvelous power of concentration, Napoleon was able, at one and the same time, to attend to serious matters and to lend himself to a child's fancies. Sometimes, putting aside all his preoccupations, he would lie down on the floor at the side of his darling son and play with him as a child himself, looking out for what would amuse him or spare him vexation. Napoleon had some little maneuver piece made. These were little bits of mahogany of different colors and lengths. The tops were fretted, and these pieces represented battalions, regiments, and divisions. When the emperor wanted to try some new combination of troops, some new military evolution, he made use of these pieces of wood, which he set up on the carpet of the floor so as to give himself a larger field for maneuver. Sometimes his son would surprise him seriously occupied with the positions of these pieces, preparing himself in this way for one of those clever maneuvers which assured him victory in his battles. The child, lying on the floor at his side, pleased with the color and the form of these maneuver pieces, which reminded him of toys, would at each instant touch them with his hand and disturb the order of battle at a decisive moment just when the enemy was about to be beaten. But so great was Napoleon's presence of mind and his affection for his son that he did not allow himself to be disturbed by the disorder into which the child had thrown his strategical combinations, and contented himself, without manifesting any impatience, with putting the pieces back in their right order. His patience and kindness for his child were inexhaustible. At such times, it was not only the heir of his name and glory that he loved in this son of his. When he held him in his arm and intoxicated himself with his caresses, it was not pride or ambition which predominated in his mind. The emperor used to lunch alone. Madame de Montesquieu used to carry the king of Rome to his father at lunch every day. Napoleon would take him on his knees and amuse himself in petting him and putting his glass to the boy's lips, and would laugh heartily, chiding the child at the grimaces that it used to make when a drop of wine stung its tongue. One day, when the child was putting its mouth out to take a piece of some food which his father offered it, Napoleon drew his hand back and repeated this little practical joke twice. The third time, however, the young prince turned his head away and obstinately refused to take the tidbit. The emperor, expressing his surprise at this conduct, Madame de Montesquieu said that the child did not like people to try to deceive it, and added, "He is proud and sensitive." "He is proud and sensitive," repeated the emperor. "It is a very good thing. It is because he is like that I love him." Delighted to find these two qualities in his son, the emperor embraced him with tenderness. He used to forget his cares and public business in these short moments, and the very few persons whom he used to admit to his intimacy during this meal hour were assured of being always received by him in the most gracious manner. The Empress Josephine had asked as a favor to be allowed to have the King of Rome taken to her. Napoleon promised, but feared for her sake the emotion which the sight of this child must necessarily cause her. He, however, gave way before her pressing requests, and Madame de Montesquieu conducted the young prince to Bagatelle, a small pleasure house in the Bois de Boulogne. This took place without the knowledge of the Empress Marie-Louise, who was animated with a feeling of jealousy, which was based on the fear of the ascendancy which a woman who had been so loved by her husband might still retain over him. The excellent princess could not restrain her tears at the sight of a child who recalled such painful memories and the privation of a happiness which heaven had refused to her. She embraced him with transports. She seemed to take pleasure in the illusion produced by the thought that she was lavishing her caresses on her own child. She never wearied of admiring its strength and beauty, and could not detach herself from him. The moments during which she held him in her arms seemed to her very short. Napoleon, who was the best of fathers, could not be otherwise than a good son, and had for his mother a constant and respectful affection. His tenderness for her in public was mingled with respect and gravity. He had given her a proof of this, a proof which this venerable woman appreciated above all others, when he had appointed her patroness general of charitable institutions. Napoleon's mother was a Roman matron, both in appearance and by the loftiness of her character. Prosperity had no more dazzled her than bad fortune had cast her down. Her parsimony has been jested about, but her children always found her ready to help them with her private fortune. When the emperor was at St. Helena, his mother sent him a full account of her fortune and begged him to dispose of whatever belonged to her, an offer which Napoleon did not accept. When somebody pointed out to her at the time when she thus offered her property to her son that she was reducing herself to indigence in this way, "What does it matter?" she answered. "When I shall have nothing more, I will take my stick and I will go about begging alms for Napoleon's mother." At Pearl, which was celebrated for its size and the purity of its color, known by the name of peregrine pearl, had disappeared from the Spanish crown treasury during the troubles brought on in this country by the change of dynasty. Great search was made for this jewel. I do not know what result it had, but I think, though I cannot confirm it, that these investigations led to a discovery of another kind, namely of several letters addressed to Paris by Joachim, King of Naples. To judge from the terms of this correspondence, it appeared certain that Murat's friends had thought it something might happen which would render the imperial throne vacant. Fouché, Talleyrand, and others had thought of taking their precautions in view of such an event. The emperor, having neither children nor any fixed successor at that time, King Murat might consider himself authorized to prepare himself to establish the claims he had to the succession. This ambition was perhaps excusable at a time when every head was excited by the splendid instances of prodigious fortunes. Napoleon seemed to think so, for he manifested no resentment against his brother-in-law. Fouché had said one day that if the throne ever became vacant, which, with God's help, should never be, he would take measures to get as much power into his hands as possible. The emperor answered this remark with some words which were remembered. "You would do well. It would be your right." Napoleon, however, thought it right to have the person in whose possession these letters were found, he was a chamberlain to King Joachim, arrested, and he was confined for 3 months in the prison at Vincennes. On leaving the prison, this officer was given the choice of returning to Naples or of staying in France, but not in Paris. He retired to an estate which he owned in Poitou, and the famous letters were deposited in the imperial archives. These circumstances and other reasons for discontent irritated the King of Naples. His bad temper broke out when he was ordered to send a contingent of Neapolitan troops to join the French army. In the month of August of this year, 1811, the signs of a misunderstanding with Russia and the hidden preparations for war which were beginning to be made by this power obliged the emperor to increase the garrison at Danzig and to put the French army on a larger footing. King Murat wished the emperor rather to recall the French soldiers who had remained in the kingdom of Naples. Napoleon had refused to do this, and then Joachim wanted to exact that the French who had remained in his service should naturalize themselves Neapolitan subjects. All the French asked for their leave, with the exception of one general who occupied a high position in the king's household. General Excelmans and generals and civil officers who were strongly attached to the king and who had been presented with important offices at court preferred to give up all these advantages rather than to lose their French nationality. Napoleon received with indignation the news of the pretensions set up by the king, his brother-in-law. A severely worded decree reminded Murat of the fact that his kingdom was an integral part of the French Empire, and that the sovereign seated on the throne of Naples owed his crown to French valor. This decree proclaimed with cold disdain that every French citizen was de jure a citizen of the Kingdom of Naples, and that any measure to the contrary emanating from King Joachim might in no case be applicable to French subjects. The King of Naples could not The King of Naples could not endure with calm the humiliation thus inflicted on him. The struggle of the opposite feelings of wounded pride and passionate affection for the emperor, which raged within him, very nearly drove him mad. I have heard the queen, his wife, say that she kept her husband isolated from everybody for 2 days for fear that anybody should see the state of aberration into which he had fallen. In his rage, King Joachim had even wished to exile the queen to Castellamare because she disapproved of the conditions of naturalization imposed on the French. Returning to a better state of mind, Murat sent his wife to Paris to make peace with Napoleon. Napoleon really liked Joachim Murat. He spoke severely at first about his brother-in-law, but soon all traces of dissent disappeared on both sides. The King of Naples returned, as in the good times of the past, to bring to our ranks during the war with Russia, which broke out in the following year, the assistance of his heroic valor and enthusiasm, with which he knew how to inspire his troops, and especially the cavalry. In the spring of 1811, there was a change in the ministry, a circumstance which till then had only happened very rarely. As a matter of fact, during Napoleon's reign, the ministers were, so to speak, irremovable. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs alone did not participate in this immutability. The vicissitudes undergone in consequence of the troubled state of our relations with Europe necessitated an occasional change in the direction of foreign affairs. In consequence, Count Daru entered the ministry, where he took the place of the Duc de Bassano, who himself had replaced the Duc de Cador. Count de Roux brought to his new post that indefatigable ardor for work, which had attracted the emperor's attention, those capacities, that rigidity of morals, and that uprightness, which have always characterized the administrative career of this minister. Napoleon had in Monsieur Daru a confidence which was absolute because it was founded on esteem. During the emperor's stay in Moscow, Monsieur Daru gave him an account of a private letter which he had just received from General Moreau's wife. This lady asked Monsieur Daru to support a request which he was making to be allowed to land in France, where her presence was rendered necessary by certain family affairs. Napoleon, suspecting the real motive of Madame Moreau's request, a motive which was clearly exposed by subsequent events, refused this permission but bore Monsieur Daru no grudge for this action in this matter. When Moreau's presence in the headquarters of the Allied troops in 1813 was made known, the emperor contented himself with reminding Monsieur Daru of the communication which he had made him at the Kremlin. On one hand, Napoleon had a great respect for Count de Roux. It cannot, on the other hand, be said that he had any sympathy for him personally. He appreciated his work and always found him useful, but he never showed him any expansive confidence. Monsieur Daru's attitude towards the emperor on his side was marked by a singular reserve. I am unable to say whether there was any reason for this minister's embarrassment in the presence of his sovereign, and whether the resemblance of his former relations with General Moreau or some other reason influenced his feelings towards Napoleon. Whatever may be the conjectures formed on this matter, the truth is that Monsieur Daru served the emperor with zeal and fidelity, but that the latter did not like him. Monsieur Daru was convinced, I am sure that I do not know for what reason, that Napoleon did not trust him. In the last year of his life, this minister did me the honor of telling me that each time that he went to see the emperor, he took the key of his writing table with him in his pocket, ready at the slightest expression of discontent on Napoleon's part to hand him over his key, begging him to send for his family papers. He would have seen, added Monsieur Daru, by comparing the inventory of my possessions when I entered his service with the existing state of my affairs, that I had not increased my fortune in any illegitimate way. Before speaking of the journey which the emperor took in 1811 with Marie Louise, I wish to say a word about a dispatch which was sent to him towards the end of May by Marshal Davout, who was commanding the troops stationed in the Hanseatic provinces. At the time of the first occupation of these provinces, serious malversations of public money had been committed. The general who was at that time in command of this district in Hanover, who since had reached a lofty destiny, was said to have tolerated this disorder. The magistrates of the states occupied by our armies had lent themselves to the sacrifices which were being suggested to them as likely to be profitable to the interests of their towns. Prince Deckmule, who came to Hamburg long after, who was as inaccessible to corruption as he was a strict disciplinarian, insisted on a speedy payment of the taxes. The towns replied that it was only fair that the sums which they had already paid, and which amounted to these 4 millions, should be taken into account, as these sums had not been paid either into the army treasury or into the treasury of the extraordinary domain. The marshal replied by demanding the local authorities to produce the proofs of payment of the war indemnities. After long hesitation, the Senate of Hamburg finally consented to hand in a list of people who had received either money or presents, together with a full account of the sums paid in cash or kind to each person named.